While I'm getting situated here, I'm excited about this session because we talked about a lot of the stuff that HITRUST has done and what's available over the past couple of days. This session is specifically focused on the work that we've done. We'll talk about that a little bit, but we're going to really focus on where we're going with the CSF and maybe HITRUST more broadly. So, Andrew, if you can introduce yourself, and then Bimal, I'll get logged in.
Yeah. So welcome. I'm Andrew Russell, VP of Standards, and my role at HITRUST is to maintain the library and to add and maintain authoritative sources and those mappings.
Good morning. I'm Bimal Sheth. Introduced myself before, but I'm the EVP of Standards Development and Assurance Operations. So the teams that develop the framework and the teams that do QA on assessments both roll up to me, and excited to be here this morning.
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited, as I mentioned, to be joined by the two of them. So these are two individuals that most people don't even know exist within HITRUST. We kind of keep them locked in a room, like thinking of really cool things and trying to figure out what HITRUST is doing well, not doing well, and how we can improve. So when you look at what the framework consists of and all the mappings that we're doing, it's all Andrew and his team. So really excited to have Andrew here. But we're going to get into the agenda real quick. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about where we're at today, right? So with version 11, what were we trying to accomplish? But more importantly, we're going to talk about where we're going. So we have a couple of releases coming up, which we'll dig into, and then we're going to go out even further and talk about the next major version release. So, Bimal, we have consistently evolved, if you will, right? From a HITRUST perspective, we're constantly.
We're just static.
Well, I bring that up because we're not always just making it up on our own, right? So we do gather feedback, and I think that went into what we were trying to do with version 11, right?
Yeah, no, it's something that we spent a fair amount of time doing, and in my role and working with Andrew, we solicited a great deal of feedback from you guys in the HITRUST community through a number of listening sessions, through scouring support tickets, through looking at our user voice forums, talking to assessors, talking to customers, and saying, what is it about the framework? Where can we improve? Where can we make things easier for you guys? And it was surprising how those sessions collated around a few important themes. And I think at that point, prior to version 11, it was really around saying, hey, moving from that I1 to the R2 in the 9X series, it was really hard. There wasn't a ton of overlap between the requirements, and that made it kind of left folks with the impression that they were basically doing the work for an I1 and then throwing it away as they were moving to an R2. And that really wasn't how we wanted people to view it, and it wasn't the journey we wanted folks to go on. I'd say the other thing we learned was those wonderful illustrative procedures that were mentioned in the previous session, they were kind of hidden, and they weren't enumerated. And so that made it really hard for people to understand really what is the ask. So you'd go and you'd see a single sentence requirement statement, and you'd think, oh, okay, that's fine. And then you dig into the illustrative procedures, and it's kind of this blob of text, and you're doing sentence surgery, and it's hard. And it's, different people read things differently, and so it was a little bit difficult to understand what the actual ask was and how many asks there were. And then we also heard your feedback that there were a number of similar asks. You'd read a requirement, understand the ask, and then, I don't know, maybe 15 requirements later, you'd read another requirement and say, wow, that seemed almost exactly like the other one I read. And so it kind of led to this, I would call it a culture of, hey, is it really a different ask? Like if people would start questioning themselves of, is it a different ask? Is it the same ask? Why is it just worded differently? You know, why is it worded differently? So that was a challenge. And I think the other challenge we heard was, you know, a lot of the authoritative sources, you know, were a few versions old, right? So they weren't as useful to you guys because they hadn't been refreshed in a while. And we wanted to kind of breathe some new life into those and make them more useful. And kind of the last thing we heard prior to 11 was all the privacy content was really in one domain. And it was in this data protection and privacy domain. And you know, if you had privacy content in your assessment, it became a massive domain. I mean, it was unwieldy for folks. And but security content was spread pretty well across, you know, the other domains. And so folks were saying, why is privacy just kind of shoved into this one corner? I know it was a valid question. And lately, we're hearing more about AI. So what can we do to address the risk of AI? And, you know, a lot of the questions, as I mentioned in a previous session on, you know, hey, what risks do you see in AI? So that's a bit of what we're hearing right now from you guys.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me to demonstrate that we are listening is kind of the revamping of the I-1. So we released the I-1. We realized based on talking to assessors, talking to customers, it somewhat missed the mark. And we spent a good amount of time last year trying to figure out exactly how it missed the mark. And that's when we were able to build what the I-1 is today. So Andrew, I'd like to go to the next slide and maybe you can talk through some of the specific changes that came with version 11.
Yeah, sure. So we took the feedback that BMO was mentioning and we developed a roadmap to maintain the HITRUST CSF to address those concerns. We earlier this year released version 11. There's a lot of features we're going to go through over the next few slides, so I won't beat that to death. And then since that release, we've released a minor version, v11.1, and next week we're going to release another minor version, 11.2, both focused on maintaining the library, refreshing existing sources, and adding new sources. And if you're concerned, you're just trying to blow up my assessment size, when we add authoritative sources, we don't inherently increase any of the baselines. So the E1 doesn't change, I1 doesn't change, R2 doesn't change. What it does, though, it allows the assessed entity to add authoritative sources to address rapidly changing compliance risks and expand on the whole concept of assessing once, reporting many. So it throws more options out there if you want them. And then coming soon, which it's too far out to actually put a date on, we do have another major version plan, V12, so we're not picking a number this time. And that's going to be focused on restructuring our privacy content.
So, BMO, there clearly was a deliberate effort with version 11. So can you talk to us a little bit about the design principles?
Yeah, so one of the things that we looked at in going into the 11 design was, okay, what are our North Stars? What do we really want to achieve to make sure that we have the outcomes that we want for the community, and how can we be reactive to the feedback that we've received and not just stick our heads in the sand and act like everything's okay. And so that started with a design principle called streamlining the assessments. We said, okay, we have this wealth of data about 9X assessments. What is it that we can really do to add value to the community? And we said, let's take a look at how those assessments are constructed, and in version 11, can we make it easier for folks without degrading the quality of that assessment and the assurances that that provides? And we were able to do that through what I think is a pretty innovative way, which is by bringing in threat intelligence data to determine which controls were really necessary in the assessment. So we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes, but I think the net result of it is when we ran the simulations for version 9.4 assessments and forward, when they were upgraded to 11, they had about almost a 6% reduction in the number of requirement statements in the assessment. And we thought that was a win for everyone out there to say, okay, no longer are we going to be blind to just continually adding more and more requirements into the assessment. We're going to try to manage this in a manner so that our R2 customers are more efficient in their assessment process. They're getting the same coverage of risk with fewer requirements. And I think when looking at the threat data, the other North Star we had was we have to cover a significant number of the threats out there. And we ended up covering 96% of the threats that were identified in our threat intelligence data, which is, I think, a very high level of coverage in an R2 for that threat adaptive core. And I think the combination of those two North Stars worked really well together. We also had a couple guardrails around making sure that basically we didn't break it. We didn't break one of our most important features, which is inheritance, right? And so what we wanted to do, we called this preserving inheritability. So it's a very high number of assessments that utilize inheritance from a third party, right? So whether that's one of the big cloud service providers or another, some of the colo providers, there's a high level of usage of inheritance in the community, and we wanted to say, okay, if you upgrade to V11, basically we didn't want you to be left kind of out in the cold, not being able to inherit from those third parties, because that's very important. And when we ran the simulations and when we back tested it, we were able to say, okay, over 99% of those requirements are inheritable across versions. So we didn't break inheritance, and that was, we think it was important. It allowed a kind of an easier upgrade path for the community to go to V11, because now, even if your provider was on a 9X assessment for a while, you could still inherit a number of those requirements. And finally, we heard you. We knew the sources were a bit dated, and that's being kind. 18% of them were refreshed in version 11. And I think Andrew and team have done a great job. And by 11.3, so not this next release, but the one after that, we would have refreshed every security source in the framework. And really, the way we did that was a combination of hard work by Andrew's team, and then also through the use of AI. We introduced new tooling for that team, and using that AI that's powered by OpenAI, we were able to significantly increase the throughput of the team. So now the AI is scouring the sources, helping to import those sources, and then suggesting mappings with confidence intervals for that team.
Yeah, I think the preserving inheritability was key. I mean, I get asked on a daily basis about how much am I going to be able to inherit from my existing assessments or from my service provider if we're not on the same version. And there's tools and resources that are available for folks to do that analysis, whether it be the cross-version shared responsibilities matrix, any other tools that you can think of.
Yeah, one of the things I would highlight is even, there's the shared responsibilities matrix, but even within my CSF, when you look to upgrade a assessment from a 9X version to 11, there's some preview functionality that we built that you can download that will basically show you all of the changes from your current assessment to what the new assessment would be. And so you can see which requirements are added or removed, and then cross-reference that with the shared responsibilities matrix to see what's still inheritable.
So we've talked about the traversable portfolio probably a couple times this week, but anything you want to point out?
Really, I didn't realize we'd mentioned that. Maybe we showed the slide a few times. But no, version 11 actually powered it because of that. The way we architected it, we were able to allow people to kind of go from that E1 to an R2 or I1 and R2, or if they just need to stop at an I1 or an E1 and use it as a destination, we can definitely do that as well with version 11.
One topic that I don't think we've talked about in a lot of detail is the threat adaptive nature of the portfolio. So can we dig into this, the bubble slide, as I like to call it?
Oh, that's better. My son saw this slide and he's like, "Why do you have Skittles on the screen?" So, I now call it the Skittles slide. But when we looked at how to, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we get to an answer where we're delivering a more streamlined assessment product in the R2 to the community without degrading the level of assurances. And it was quite the challenge. And we finally realized, it comes down to control selection and how are those controls picked to be in an assessment, and what value does each control provide? What risk is it attempting to mitigate? And we said, how could we be more efficient in control selection? And the answer was, why don't we look at the threats, right? And so we went out, we got threat intelligence data, and we said, okay, how can we leverage this threat intelligence data? Well, the answer was the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I give a lot of credit to our innovation team, Jeremy's team, that spent countless hours working through this to make sure we had a really great approach and an innovative approach that said, okay, the threat intelligence data indicates these are the threats out in the wild. We can map it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, looking at the tactics and sub-techniques, and then what are the mitigations that MITRE recommends in that in the attack framework. And those mitigations then can be mapped to CSF requirements. And that mapping then forms the basis of what is necessary in an assessment to mitigate that, basically mitigate that risk, right? And then I think that allowed us to challenge why every requirement was in there, and then streamline that down to say, actually you don't need certain requirements. And it's funny, I was talking to a colleague who works at one of the big four and specializes in SOC reporting. And I asked, I was like, okay, how are you guys, when you have a new customer, how are you guys working through control selection? And she said, well, we get them to write down their process. We look for controls. We kind of kick the tires a little bit. And the controls that they aren't very good at, we replace them with controls that they're really good at. And I said, so you get them to self-select the controls, and you only pick the ones they're really good at. How does that correlate back to risk? And how are you making sure that you're addressing the risk? And she said, well, it's really about making sure that they can, generate a report without a lot of deviations or exceptions. And I said, well, okay, here's how we generate the controls and kind of why each control is there. And her eyes kind of lit up and she said, wow, that's a lot different. I said, yeah, it kind of removes some of the subjectivity and gives you a basis and a kind of a why for why a control is there. And so she was quite interested in that approach, and I sent her a copy of the Skittles slide.
So we started doing this last year, right, with the first release of the I1. How many controls have we changed in our quarterly analysis to date?
So initially, there was some suggested edits that we were mulling over. It had to do with update frequency for systems that didn't allow for automated updates. But ultimately, when we moved to V11, along with those updates that we were thinking about making, we overhauled the whole I1. And since then, we've done this analysis twice, and we're going on the third one soon, and we haven't had any changes to the coverage.
So it's not a moving target, because I'm often asked, if we're looking at this threat data pretty frequently and the control set potentially could change, is that going to be an issue?
I mean, it could change, right? But any change that we make to the I1 is going to be justifiable. There's going to be a specific threat that we're going to indicate this is prevalent. We're seeing an increase of this percentage, and it's tied to this mitigation, and this is specifically why it's coming in, not just, we felt it was good.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that, and this may sound biased, and clearly I am, like HITRUST is spending thousands of hours and in some cases millions of dollars into innovative things like this to make sure that the framework is maintaining its relevancy, right? And I always use ISO as my cliche example, right? So ISO 27001, they released their new control set last year, 2022. Prior to that, anybody really quickly? I may have mentioned it on Monday. Anybody know? 2013, right? There's a 9-year gap between where their controls were versus where they are now. Just imagine the way the threat landscape has changed and the way that the technology has changed in a 9-year period.
It's been pretty static, right? Yeah.
Yes, it's been very static. No drama whatsoever. All right, Andrew, so we've talked kind of at a high level about the illustrative procedures versus the evaluative elements and some of the changes we made in version 11. Can you talk us through, in more detail?
And I think this slide speaks for itself. If you look at a version 9 requirement statement and side with the equivalent version 11, you can easily see how many evaluative elements are in the V11. There's 5, which adds a lot of transparency on how much each of those adds to the total score. And you can parse it very quickly. You can say, okay, well, I need to do this, 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 and this. Done. You don't have to flip back and forth between the requirement in MyCSF and a PDF version of the illustrative procedures. It's all there.
Yeah, when we were talking about this session, these two fine gentlemen were like, well, how has this been received? Because I'm talking to the market every day. And honestly, it's been pretty well received by both customers and assessors alike. It's alleviated the confusion that used to be that stream of conscious text blob. So now it's very, very clear what the expectations are and what needs to be tested. So the back and forth between the assessors and the customers, I mean, there's probably still some of that, but from what I'm hearing, it's less confusing at this point. All right, so we've talked a lot about version 11 and 11.1. What's next?
All right, so like they said, they've been keeping me in a cage. I've been working on the V11.2, and I'm happy to announce that it comes out next week. And it's going to include some library maintenance on the consolidation of requirements with full evaluative element matches, and I'll go into that, I promise, on the next slide. But really importantly, we're adding in a new selectable factor on this 11.2 version. It's going to be the artificial intelligence risk management factor. And if you select it, the requirements that get brought into your assessment are going to address the controls within ISO IEC 23894, which doesn't roll off the tongue very well, and ISO 31000. And it'll allow the assessed entity to report against those plus the NIST AI risk management framework. Also in 11.2 is going to be the Ontario Personal Health Information Protection Act and the New York OHIP Moderate Plus version 5 baseline.
Yeah, so if you were in the session yesterday where we talked about compliance insights, 11.2 really sets the stage and puts the capability into the framework and ultimately MyCSF in order to generate those compliance insights. So Andrew, this seems like a lot of stuff.
It's a ton, and like Bimo mentioned, it's entirely been enabled by our use of AI, where we take an authoritative source document, whether it be a PDF, Excel, or Word file, or website. We put it in our system, and an AI runs against it and says, all right, here's the matches I think you have. And then it goes through 4 levels of human review before it gets added to a version release. So it's not like we're just giving to the AI and hoping for the best by any means. It's definitely human involvement, but it's accelerated our mapping process. Instead of having to flip through and think about all 2,000 plus requirements against a single control, you're getting fed a lot of information up front.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is inside baseball, but previously HITRUST was trying to do releases at least on an annual basis. Sometimes that happened, sometimes that didn't. But I think what we're trying to commit to now is maybe 1 or 2 maybe 3 releases a year as we're able to, based on our new capability leveraging AI.
Yeah, right now the target is every 6 months to have a version release, whether it be a major release or a minor release.
And Bimo, really coming back to you really quickly, all those releases, at least for version 11, will keep the design principles in mind. So because my mind immediately goes to my assessor days, every time there's a release, everything blows up and I've got to start all over in some cases.
Yeah, no, I think it goes back to the tooling that the team has now. We're able to do basically back testing, right? So to test how a release candidate might be used in the wild, and kind of build those assessments and run analytics and say, okay, let's maybe not pull that lever as hard because it can have a detrimental impact to the community, by increasing assessment size, or look, this is going to break inheritance on a frequently inherited requirement statement, so that's gonna cause a problem. Those kinds of analytics are really now possible with the enhanced tooling.
So Andrew, you mentioned library efficiencies and enhancements. This slide kind of talks to that, but it's too big brain for me. Can you cover it?
All right, so like I mentioned, we're consolidating requirement statements in this next version for requirements that have full evaluative element matches. So in this example, there's 3 unique requirements, but really they're not. I mean, they're not unique because they're the same content. And what we're doing is we're going to take these and consolidate all the mappings and all the underlying inheritance so that there's no impact to an assessment moving between an 11.1 or an 11.2 and 11.2. But at the same time, if you're in a more complicated assessment that happens to have these 3 requirements, you won't anymore.
And the immediate question comes to mind is, how did it even come to this?
So it was an initial design decision on how the library was structured, where you have the 3 primary levels, one being baseline. It gets progressively more rigorous depending on the complexity of the organization. And anytime an additional authoritative source had a control that wasn't in those 3 levels, a segment was created. So you might have seen like a HIPAA segment or a FedRAMP segment. And the design decision was, if something was in those segments, it wasn't used in a different source. So if 2 sources had the same control that wasn't in the 3 levels, you ended up with a duplicate requirement. Now, a smaller assessment will never see that. Or an assessment that's like a baseline R2 plus like 1 authoritative source, you probably won't run into that. But if you have like 2 or 3 authoritative sources, you probably will start seeing repetitive requirements, and we're removing that.
All right, so moving on, right? Because we're keeping the train rolling. 11.3, what can we expect?
So I'll start with the release date, which is the end of Q1, beginning of Q2, and it's going to be pretty big. I mean, we're going to revisit GDPR, so that's exciting. We're also going to add state ramp, text ramp, and FedRAMP, all based off of NIST 853 Rev 5. So very excited to get those on. Also adding PCI version 4, CIS version 8, FFIC CAT, and that's just where we're at right now with the work.
And on the last slide, we talked about clearly duplicative requirements. In this version, we're going to go and try to tackle where there might be some partial overlap.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to do the same exact exercise for consolidation. It's going to require a little bit more analysis because it's partial matches. And what we don't want to do is reduce coverage of any authoritative source or break inheritance. So we're kind of working around those constraints, but looking through the library with a finer tooth comb.
And kind of looking ahead in what else we're considering from an authoritative source perspective. We've got almost seemingly an exhaustive list.
No, this is not that many. No, this is a subset of the authoritative sources that we're tracking, we're considering to add, and future releases. On this list, some of the more exciting ones are like the MITRE Atlas, which it's in draft, but a lot of sources are already citing it, and so we're kind of keeping an eye on it. And if it goes final, then it's going to be in one of the closer releases to it. And also the OWASP AI Security and Privacy Guide. But if you're looking at this list and there's an authoritative source that you want to see added or that you think would be good for some risk coverage, reach out either through any of the methods that Beamel's mentioned, or if you do happen to have my contact information, you can email me. But this isn't an exhaustive list of everything we're tracking, but I think if there's a demand, that we're open to moving things up.
Yeah, I'm excited to actually see CMMC get added back to the framework, because there's lots of work that the CMMC team has been doing to try to get it out and official. And there are folks in the audience or really in the community at large who are working within the defense industrial base. There's definitely a place for them to leverage HITRUST to meet those needs.
Yeah, we're watching CMMC closely and anticipating that final release.
All right, so looking way out there, Beamel, what can we expect in version 12?
Looking into our crystal ball. So, one of the, I would say, feedback points that we haven't really hit from you guys is really that issue of all the privacy content being in one domain. And that's something that we realized we couldn't fix immediately in V11. And we said, this requires a little bit more thought, and we need to make sure what we're going to do is not overly impactful to the community. And so that one was a very purposeful, kind of deferred item. And we said, okay, in 12, we need to think about how to address that feedback point. One of the things that we're exploring, and we're still very, candidly, we're very early in the exploration process, is restructuring domain 19 and saying, okay, can we move that into basically 3 separate domains, which better align with how ISO has structured their privacy content in 29.151. And I think we're still exploring what that really means, and then how that would impact impact the community as a whole. I think there's a lot of work left to do on how that would impact folks who do predominantly security assessments that don't really focus on privacy versus those who choose to include the privacy controls in their assessment, or include what I would call predominantly privacy-based authoritative source, such as GDPR, right? What does that really mean for your assessment, and kind of what assurances is that providing? So this is where we're headed. Still, candidly, a lot of work left to do, but we do want to hear from you guys in terms of feedback with where there might be some opportunities for improvement. We're always very receptive to that. You can, Andrew mentioned reaching out to him directly. We also monitor support tickets that come in, and then there's also a feedback forum in MyCSF where you can offer feedback and improvement ideas for the CSF as a whole.
Yeah, and shameless plug, there's also a subreddit for HITRUST and a Discord channel. So if you're interested in joining any of those, find me afterwards, and I will immediately direct you to Jeremy, who knows way more about it than I do. So one thing that I'd like to put a bug in your ear to consider as a former assessor, when you take a domain that's really big and then you break it out, the chance of having scoring issues increases. So as you think about the design principles on that.
Yeah, no, and it was something that we definitely considered in the I1, that, we try to avoid single points of failure. In the E1, it was kind of a conscious decision that we probably couldn't, just because of the small size of the overall assessment. But yeah, it's the sensitivity of a requirement statement on the overall domain score is something that we factor in.
And does this mean that HITRUST is trying to take a more prominent stance from a privacy perspective, because I feel like the globe, the world is starting to really ratchet down from a privacy perspective.
It is, and we've seen the market move that way. There's just an explosion of privacy-based sources that are out there. There's a lot of regulation that's been proposed. Some of it enacted. Much of it, at least in the U.S., has been on the state level. But we continue to work with our government affairs team to monitor that, and even at the federal level, should they choose to act, trying to shape that policy.
I think we might have one more announcement.
Oh yeah. So for those of you that were with us yesterday morning, we did talk about assurances over AI, and one thing I wanted to highlight here is really that velocity of AI sources. So Andrew touched on it earlier, but you'll start to see as those sources go final, out of draft, you'll start to see more and more of them incorporated into the framework. And really, we're trying to get them to you as quickly as possible, given how quickly the space is moving. We recognize there's a lot of value in moving quickly. But we also, as I said yesterday, when we're setting that bar of acceptable AI assurances, we're going to be very thoughtful in what controls ultimately get included in that AI certification. But the foundation of it and the consideration will be those authoritative sources where we're kind of handpicking the relevant controls and the controls that we think are most appropriate to include in that AI certification.
All right, with that, are there any questions? Lee, I think you got your hand up first, and then we'll come to you.
How do I know, as you go through the new point updates, how do I know what I'm missing an opportunity to use or what I might be asked about? Because we're very much used to the 2-year cycle, assessment, interim, get ready on the next version for the next assessment, and that's sort of what we've done. But this sounds like we need to speed that up. So how are you going to help us manage that speed up?
I can start. Andrew and Ryan, I think you guys both may have some perspective. I think it's indicative of the velocity of change in the industry as a whole, right? All of us just have to move much faster now. And, when we release a new version, there's a lot of aids to help you kind of manage that change. So I'd say first and foremost, every version gets an advisory that gives you a high-level summary of what's changed. So 11.2 will be no different, where it announces kind of any changes to the core, right? So did we make any kind of wording updates to a requirement that's in that core, or are there new sources coming in? Were there sources that are scheduled for removal? Those kinds of things. On a more granular assessment basis, what I would encourage you to do, and I feel like it's the best hidden feature of my CSF that no one knows about, is you can take any assessment. It doesn't matter whether it's complete or incomplete, and simulate that upgrade to a later version, and it'll generate that preview report that tells you literally everything down to the character level of what changed. And it also kind of what I think is most useful is it can categorize that what changed. Was it something in the requirement? Was it something in an illustrated procedure? Was it a mapping change? And build your pivot table off of that to harness that data. And I think the other part that you can consider off of that is, okay, is that may not impact me, I'm in year one, it's not going to impact my interim, but it's something that's going to impact my recertification, right? And so, once you have that data, the time to prepare is now. I'm infamous for saying, don't stick your head in the sand to my teams. So this is, again, an instance of don't stick your head in the sand. Don't wait. Do it now and start thinking about how it'll impact you. I would say the other thing to consider is newer versions tend to bring more functionality, going forward. And so, some of the compliance insights reports will work on, I think, 11.2 and later. And so if that's functionality that you need because you have a stakeholder that's asking you about HIPAA compliance, right? Consider that need for functionality as you look at your upgrade path as well. So, Andrew, Ryan?
Yeah, so I agree with the functionality piece, and I would add, one, rely on your external assessors, right? They're the ones who are doing this stuff every single day, but you need to ask yourself really two questions on top of what Beamal mentioned is, why are we here? Like I always ask customers, like, what's your business driver? Why are you trying to pursue HITRUST and what's important to you? That may indicate what version is appropriate. To Beamal's point, if you need compliance insights, then absolutely. You need to go to 11.2 or whatever. The other thing I would offer is you need to consider threat, right? Maybe in a new version, there's a new control set that's actually addressing a brand new threat that's happening, and it might make sense for you to take advantage of doing the work against that new control set.
Yeah, and that takes us right back to looking at the advisory when we release those, because if there was a change due to the threat landscape, in our threat analysis, they would be communicated through that.
Easy to read text. That's a lifesaver. That's hours and hours spent. So thank you very much for that.
We liked it too.
The hidden tool, because I was going to ask about, I've got a validated 9.6. Can I just convert that over to 11.2 so I can start working on the next phase? Since you say we can do that, a webinar or some video showing us that, and big arrows saying do this would be great.
That is great, and I'm trying to look and see if I see Dennis Palmer here, I think Blake can take that one, and we'll get some videos or something out on exactly how to use that upgrade tool that's in my CSF, because we use it all the time to help people through it, and even if I would say this as well, if you ever have a question like that, absolutely reach out to support. They can also walk you through it as well, but we'll get a video out.
Any other questions? Going once? All right. Well, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me on stage, and on to the next session.
Thank you.